Obamacare opponents just can't seem to catch a break these days. Every time they turn around, their ACA is a failure frown is turned upside down into an ACA ain't half bad smile. Some are now arguing that we're seeing a major shift in the political strategy of Republicans. Friend of Nerdland Igor Volsky wrote on Think Progress, Republicans may be backing off Obamacare position and focusing on other ways to hit Democrats over things like Benghazi, and an issue given its own select committee in the House just this week. But I want to ask our panel today, are Republicans really abandoning their opposition to the Affordable Care Act? Or is this just wishful thinking? Joining me now, Jay Angoff, former director of the Office of Consumer Information and Assurance Oversight at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and partner at Murray and Scarlett. I know I got that wrong. Tara Dowdell, who is a Democratic strategist, Avik Roy, who is senior fellow at Manhattan Institute, and Dr. Althea Maybank, who is assistant commissioner in the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and director of the Brooklyn District Public Health Office, and as we call her around here, Dr. McStuffins.
They're just tired. They've been fighting this longer than we fought in World War II. You know, there are 5 stages of grief. Denial.
Is that true? I'm sorry. I was like, wait a minute, is that hyperbole? Is this really been going on longer than?
Yes.
Okay.
More than 4 years. 5 stages of grief. First is denial. Second is anger. Sure, there's some people who are still angry, and they're going to
on phase 2.
and they're going to be stuck, and they're going to be stuck there. But there are a lot of people who have accepted it. That's the final stage. You don't have to love it. You don't have to love our president, but this is the law, and a lot of Republicans have accepted it.
All right, so Avik, let me ask you what stage of grief you're in at this moment, right? I mean, part of what I want to do is, even beyond the politics, because we could talk about the politics, but I also just sort of wonder, I know that you've been generally opposed to the law, but given sort of, and I know the rollout was a mess, no one is suggesting it wasn't, but where we are now, 8 million people signed up, folks paying their premiums, are you willing to concede that there is any part of it that is perhaps imperfect, but maybe a pretty good law?
I think I've actually been very consistent in saying that there are parts of the law that are constructive, while I think there are large parts of the law that are bad policy, and that Republicans should accept the fact that the law is here to stay. Now, that's different from approving of the law, right? So it's one thing to say 8 million people have signed up and therefore the law is entrenched and won't be repealed. It's another thing to say that the law is popular. Polls consistently show that pluralities or majorities disapprove of the law instead of approving of it. And so that goes back to the election. Yes, Republicans are going to run on Obamacare because in a lot of those states, the law is still unpopular.
Right. So I think this is such an important point, right? That in fact, many people, when you ask them simply about Obamacare or ACA, they say, I'm opposed to it, I don't like it. But then when you take kind of the parts of it apart, you say, well, do you like being able to cover your kids until they're 25? Do you like the idea of Medicaid expanding to a larger proportion of people? They say, oh, no, I'm down for that. Is that an ACA? So that could just be a branding. In other words, people thinking that they don't like it may not be that they're actually opposed to the policy.
But all laws, and particularly when it comes to health care reform, all laws have trade-offs. And so those benefits come at a cost. The plans are more expensive on the ACA exchanges than the plans were last year in 2013. There are going to be people who pay higher taxes. There are going to be people whose Medicare benefits are trimmed. So that may be a good thing overall, and you could certainly make that argument. But there are trade-offs, and there are people who are going to be adversely affected.
All right, so I like this idea of trade-offs. There was a win for the GOP establishment in North Carolina this week when State House Speaker Tom Tillis scored more than 40% of the primary vote, and thereby preventing a runoff with any of the other 7 candidates, including a Rand Paul-backed Tea Partier. That was Tuesday. That's when incumbent Democratic Senator Kay Hagan learned who her opponent will be this fall. And Hagan, who's considered to be among the most vulnerable Democratic incumbents up for re-election this year, her race is being called the 2014 Bellwether Contest by NBC News' own political team. Hagan, who now had to decide her strategy for the general election campaign. On Thursday, we found out which way she'd go on Obamacare. And we found out she is going to go all in.
Last year in North Carolina, our state legislature and governor decided against expanding the state's Medicaid program. And as a result, about 500,000 people who would have qualified for coverage through Medicaid are now not able to do so. And just to be sure, if a state expanded its Medicaid program last year, what would the state have to pay in 2014?
That would be zero. The state doesn't pay in the initial year.
So for 3 years, the states pay zero.
The federal government will pay for those years.
Right.
Okay, that wasn't just any Democrat aggressively defending the Affordable Care Act Medicaid expansion, but one who is fighting tooth and nail to remain senator in the midterm elections in a vividly purple state. In a tough race, Hagan seems to believe that being out front and vocally supportive of Obamacare is just the place to be. Jay, were you surprised by that level of aggressiveness on the part of Hagan?
Pleasantly surprised, but it makes sense. And that's because with the Medicaid expansion, as the Secretary Designate was saying, at the most, even in the long run, the state only pays 10% of the cost. But for the first 3 years, the state pays zero. So states can expand Medicaid for 3 years for no state money. And then if at the end of that 3 years they decided, you know, we'd like that a lot better when we had a lot more uninsured people, then they can go back and they can make them uninsured again.
But I have heard over and over again from Republicans that this is the trap, that this is basically like an adjustable rate mortgage being sold to you. You don't have to pay much in the beginning, but that just 10% for these strapped states is going to be a big deal on the back end. Like, it is the one argument I hear from Republicans. I think, okay, that maybe makes, okay, I could get why people would be concerned about that.
That is the dominant concern about Republicans. That first of all, you can't just switch it off once you put people on this program. You're not going to throw them on the street after you've put them on coverage for 3 years. So I think it has been done, but it's very
in North Carolina,
and people don't want to go down that road. And in terms of the 90%, you mentioned in the long run, and that's the key sentence. In the long run, I think a lot of Republicans feel that 90% match from the federal government will go down because the federal government has these big deficits. It's always under pressure. Even the president in his budgets that Ms. Burwell actually developed, proposed narrowing that match down, having a blended match rate that decreases the share that the federal government is supporting Medicaid. So a lot of state governments are concerned about that, and it is a legitimate concern.
Right. So it feels fiscally like I just want to put a finger on that. Feels like a legitimate concern fiscally. I think that is a question worth answering and talking about.
If you get people insurance, if you get them access to medical care, then costs by definition go down, because right now people are using the emergency room. And if you go and you have strep throat in the average emergency room in this country, you will pay $600 to $700. If you go into a doctor's office for the same treatment, you're talking about $60 to $70. So this argument, your argument only tells half the story. And so we have already seen that the cost curve is starting to bend. The cost curve that was going up is starting to stabilize because people have access to care. Readmissions, and I'm sure Dr. Ed Maybank can attest to this, hospital readmissions are down. In this very short period of time, they're down. What that means is that's less cost, less pressure on the system, and that means if that continues to happen in the long term, we'll see that pressure go down.
So it's both a long term, it's both a time horizon, but also a big picture.
Well, so, you know, I just want to get back to this point about the quality and the cost of the Medicaid expansion. So the gold standard study in this regard was the Oregon Medicaid experiment. And that study showed that, in fact, costs went up, utilization went up. Emergency room utilization among people who are on Medicaid went up by 40% relative to those who remained uninsured. And their health outcomes did not get better. They stayed the same.
But this was a short-term study, if I remember, right?
It was two years, and actually it's consistent with all the medical literature. I've written a whole book about this, how Medicaid fails the poor. So there's differences between types of coverage. Just because you have a card that says you have health coverage doesn't mean the quality of the care you're getting is better. Okay, and that's a real problem with Medicaid.
So that's a real thing.